Well, good morning. For those who don't know me, I'm Mark Enslacco, Director of the Human Rights Program. I don't know how many honors one gets in their career. I'm sure it's a finite number, but I don't know what the number is. But I can assure you that I think I'm using up about half of my honors here today. It's my privilege to welcome to the university to receive the 2005 Monsignor Romero Award for Leadership in Service to Human Rights to Judge Juan Guzman Tapia. And you'll hear from him today and then tonight the ceremony, which I hope you all can attend. It's going to be quite the show. I invited Juan at the behest of the Human Rights Committee, some of whose members are here, a month or so ago. And then I started to receive phone calls from people in Chile and from the United States saying that, well, Juan Guzman's coming to the University of Dayton, can we come? And I said, well, how did you find out? We hadn't announced it, but I think the word gets out, and his fame is such that a number of people wanted to attend, some of whom, turns out, couldn't. But several are here in attendance. Marjorie Agosin, who's visiting the University of Dayton again. She was here, a decade ago when Dr. Carnes organized the Voices of Democracy Symposium. She's Chilean. She's a poet. She's going to provide insight that we lawyers and social scientists really don't have, and that is the very human dimension of the issues we're going to discuss today: truth, justice, reconciliation. Also, Peter Kornbluh, the author of the Pinochet File and a senior analyst at the National Security Archives, is here. He's made a career of putting on the web the documents our government doesn't necessarily want us to see. He's written just a tremendous book about CIA and the U.S. government's awareness of, knowledge of, and involvement in events in Chile during the dictatorship. And I've invited two colleagues to really speak as discussants. Bert Lockwood is well known here, a good friend of the university. He's the director of the Urban Morgan Institute for Human Rights, editor of Human Rights Quarterly, clearly the most prestigious journal, interdisciplinary journal on human rights on the planet. I've asked him to comment as well. And like Bert, a good friend, Ted Orland, another good friend who's now on campus for the third time. Ted is director of the Human Rights Advocacy Program at Utica College, created an undergraduate program in human rights around the same time University of Dayton created its program. Ted and I were instrumental in founding the International Human Rights Education Consortium, and I'm delighted to announce that Ted has taken over as director of the International Human Rights Education Consortium, which probably means it will take off now. The order of speakers, well, I'll begin. I'll abuse my authority up here. This is a very informal panel. Then I'll ask Peter Kornbluh to speak, Marjorie Agosin, and of course Juan Guzman. We'll keep our remarks brief. We'll let Juan speak clearly as long as he wants. He's the reason we're here. And then I'll invite Bert and then Ted to speak. Truth, justice, reconciliation, just a few things, a few reflections from someone who's been traveling to Chile now for too long, deal with this dictatorship and its aftermath. As to truth, the truth about the criminality of the Pinochet regime is really beyond a reasonable doubt. It's been established to a moral certainty. There can really be no question. It would take a heroic act of denial to deny that the regime systematically abducted, tortured, murdered, and disappeared Chileans in just absolute disregard for the rule of law. I mean, this is simply established as a truth. But you know, when the transition to democracy occurred in 1990, the president at the time, Patricio Aylwin, began to speak about truth and reconciliation, but everyone knew that the word he couldn't say was justice. He established a commission. It established the truth about what had occurred, although the right in Chile and the military in particular denied that truth. There's one piece of the truth, however, that's that has not been established. And for me, that's the most critical piece. We know the Pinochet regime was criminal. We know that it disappeared more than 1,100 Chileans. We know that as a truth, an absolute truth. The truth we don't know is the truth with respect to the fate and the whereabouts of the disappeared. And as we turn to the question of justice, it becomes clear that knowing what occurred is not enough, certainly not enough without the acknowledgement of those who committed the crimes, that they committed crimes. But truth is really not enough for me as an observer, an outside observer, until the truth about the fate and the whereabouts of the disappeared is established. And progress in this area has been slow. Progress has been obstructed. There is a conspiracy of silence. And it is simply, I think, as disappearance is a crime against humanity, this refusal by those who committed these crimes to divulge meaningful information, the truth about the disappeared, constitutes yet another crime against humanity. And I think that's something that really frames our discussions. Truth, the truth is known. If you can say it this way, the historical verdict on the Pinochet regime has been rendered. But talk to anyone who has suffered under the regime, and there are thousands in Chile. They will tell you that truth is not enough. Justice, in the sense of criminal sanction, is absolutely necessary. When I was first traveling to Chile, I became one of those who was convinced that justice would never take place in Chile, that it was simply impossible. Pinochet had said, "No one will ever touch me." Well, I'm not going to speak at length about justice because Judge Guzman can do that. I just simply want to acknowledge here that, well, Pinochet has been touched. This is the man who touched him. The progress towards justice in the last, well, frankly, since Juan Guzman Tapia was appointed Ministro de Fuero, or special prosecutor, however you want to call it, the progress towards justice in Chile has been remarkable. When he began his work, Pinochet was still senator for life. When one mentioned his name at all, it was in whispers. Unless you were a Pinochetista, then you said it loudly and with reverence. But people were afraid of him. This is the context in which Judge Guzman began his work. If you look at Chile now with respect to justice, you see that the wall of impunity that the Chilean right had constructed is in shambles. It's crumbling, and the pieces of the wall are falling on those who committed these terrible crimes. There are a number of judges now who are conducting investigations into various aspects of Pinochet's criminal wrongdoing, including his laundering of money. But the fact of the matter is the environment in which judges now are meting out justice is an environment which to a great extent was created by Juan Guzman, and it was truly an act of courage. So he can talk more about justice. But let me say something about reconciliation. Again, when the democratic government arrived in Chile in 1990, it established a commission on truth and reconciliation, not truth, reconciliation, and justice, not truth and justice, truth and reconciliation. It was a euphemism then. To a certain degree, it's a euphemism now. As I said last night when this conversation here really began over dinner, perhaps I'm exaggerating the point, but I think the issue of reconciliation in Chile right now is a myth. Those who suffered terribly under the Pinochet regime need justice, demand justice, deserve justice. What's truly remarkable with respect to reconciliation is those who committed the crimes or those who supported the regime that committed the crimes did not begin to speak about reconciliation at all until 1998, when Judge Guzman began his work, or when Augusto Pinochet was detained in London. And suddenly you heard this chorus of people saying, well, what about reconciliation? We need to move forward. We need to reconcile. But the fact of the matter in Chile is that there will never be reconciliation until those who committed these crimes, or those who abetted in the crimes, or those who supported the regime who committed the crimes, will reconcile themselves to the truth that the regime was criminal. And I see no movement in that regard. Chile, in many regards, has been emblematic. It's been, the Pinochet regime was emblematic of the homicidal regimes that terrorized Latin America for a long period of time, beginning in the 60s and through the 70s and the 1980s. It was emblematic as a murderous regime. But Chile's been emblematic too for another reason, and the reason that I would really like to close with this point of emphasis. Chile's been emblematic in the sense that Chilean society's search for truth, justice, and reconciliation has been truly exemplary. There may be other societies where brave women and men have struggled as hard to achieve truth and justice, but there's no society that has struggled harder or more diligently or more courageously than Chilean society. And it is really an honor, again, to have a man who really personifies that search with us on campus. Peter.
I want to thank Dayton for inviting me and Mark Insulaco for giving me the privilege to be here. We feel that this is the same way. It is such an honor to sit next to Judge Guzman, somebody whose courage has been unparalleled and who has not only changed the lives of many of the victims of Augusto Pinochet, but given tremendous inspiration and hope to victims of human rights atrocities around the world, that someday there will be not only truth, but actually justice, both components to lead at some point to some type of reconciliation. It may not be the acknowledgement of the persecutors that they committed these crimes. In fact, some of the people that Judge Guzman has sent to jail still refuse to admit they did anything wrong. But it will be a very forceful accountability for the victims themselves, that for at least that side of Chilean society will enable them to go forward in the future and be part of their society, knowing that their struggle was vindicated by these prosecutions, by these trials, and by the evidence that was placed in the official record, whether the person, such as Augusto Pinochet, went to jail in the end or not. You know, when you go to the Central Intelligence Agency and you walk in, it's a big marble foyer there, and on this big wall above you as you walk in, it says, "The truth will set ye free." And the CIA isn't normally known to be in the business of truth. It's more known to be in the business of secrecy and covert operations, although it is, of course, also in the business of intelligence gathering, and there, at least there's an attempt to arrive at some truths. But if such a statement was written in Chile, for example, in the Tribunal of Justicia there, it would probably read, "Truth and justice will set ye free," because the truth is not enough for a society that is going through its struggle with the past, such as Chile. There not only needs to be an accounting, but there needs to be accountability as well. And when you watch what's gone on in Chile over the last few years, you see that both of those processes have gone forward. There's been a dramatic escalation led by Judge Guzman of prosecutions of some of the worst torturers and killers of the Pinochet regime, and indeed of Augusto Pinochet himself. There have been books that have been written, articles that have flowed into the press, a major report released just last November on the torture of up to 35,000 Chileans during the military regime. And all of these things have been extremely important to Chile, and I have to say extremely important to our own society here in the United States, where the whole issue of the U.S. role in Chile during the Allende period between 1970 and 73 and during the Pinochet era, 1973 to 1990, remains a controversial, salient, and extremely important issue. And it remains an issue in part because we've been able to get the declassified record, the secret archives of the CIA, the White House, the National Security Council, and other national security agencies, declassified. In 1998, just before Pinochet was arrested, in my office we were doing freedom of information work on Chile, and we asked for documents on Augusto Pinochet, and this is the type of thing we got. A document totally censored, totally blacked out. Somebody up there in the Defense Department, this is a Defense Intelligence Agency biographic sketch of Augusto Pinochet. Somebody up there was wielding the black magic marker in the name of national security and using up a lot of ink. I'm happy to say that we now have this very same document totally unredacted, totally uncensored. You can read it in my book. You can see it reproduced in my book, the Pinochet File. And you'll also see that there's almost nothing underneath here that's of any great national security importance. A lot of description of Pinochet's drinking habits and who he's married to and his religion, and he smokes cigarettes, and that he's a hardline anti-communist, which, of course, everybody knew. But this was the state of affairs vis-a-vis our ability to get to the truth of these documents in 1998. And then Augusto Pinochet was arrested in London. And that gave us an opening in Washington, human rights groups, my organization, the National Security Archive, to push for the declassification of literally hundreds of thousands of pages of records that had been buried for years in the secret vaults of the CIA, the Defense Department, the White House, the National Security Council, the State Department, and other agencies. And fortunately, we had a president in office at that point who was sympathetic to the declassification process, to the right to know, a right that we all have, you and I in this room, Chileans, everybody, to know what their government has done in their name, but usually without their knowledge. And we pushed the Clinton administration in 1998 to declassify the entire record, if possible, so that evidence of Pinochet's human rights atrocities, which had been gathered by the intelligence process that goes on alongside covert operations and political action and diplomacy and other kinds of government activities in other countries, be centralized, be reviewed, and be released so that this information could be used by the Spanish to prosecute Pinochet, or in the end, by a courageous judge in Chile, if that information was helpful. And in the end, the Clinton administration decided to do this declassification review. They called it the Chile documentation. They called it the Chile Declassification Project, and they assigned dozens of individuals to work on it. They spent several $1 million in a couple of years it took to review all these documents and get them out. It was a difficult process. The Central Intelligence Agency didn't want to cooperate, and it took a lot of effort and lobbying to get them to release their records. But in the end, 24,000 documents that we hadn't seen before that dated between 1970 and 1990 were declassified. And they've been very, very helpful in a number of ways. They've been helpful in the process of truth. They've been helpful in the process of justice. Let me just say a couple of words about the contribution of these documents to justice. I didn't bring along any of the ones that have been used in some of these cases, but I myself had the extraordinary honor of sitting in the office of Judge Guzman a year or so ago and giving an affidavit on the declassified documents that dealt with Operation Condor, which was this sinister consortium of secret police services in the southern cone of Latin America run by Chile, which collaborated in tracking down, kidnapping, torturing, and disappearing political opponents and political critics. The reach of Operation Condor extended to Washington, D.C. in 1976, when Condor's most famous mission, led by the Chilean secret police, DINA, sent agents to the capital city of our country to assassinate Pinochet's leading civilian opponent, a former diplomat named Orlando Letelier. And he was killed by a bomb placed under his car, along with a colleague of his, a 25-year-old New Jersey woman named Ronnie Moffett, on September 21st, 1976. Until the Osama bin Laden planes flew into the Pentagon, that plane flew into the Pentagon, the Letelier car bombing was actually considered the most egregious act of state-sponsored international terrorism ever committed in the capital city of the United States of America. And Judge Guzman has, with groundbreaking work, has investigated and indicted Augusto Pinochet for Operation Condor crimes. And some of the documents from the United States give background to the existence of this sinister organization. And those documents, I think, have been useful as evidence in pressing forward in this prosecution. General Augusto Pinochet is also being prosecuted by another judge. There's been a setback just last week because the Supreme Court refused to strip him of his immunity in this particular case, but he's also being investigated, and the team under him, for killing one of his predecessors as Commander-in-Chief of the Army, General Carlos Prats, who was blown up also by a car bomb along with his wife on September 30th, 1974. He was the first foreign victim of significance of the Pinochet regime. He was not a leftist by any means. He had been a career-long military officer. But because he was a part of the military and had the respect of some military officers, did represent the most significant threat to Pinochet's base of power once it became clear that Pinochet was going to stay on as a dictator in Chile. And finally, declassified documents have played a role in the prosecution that is getting the most attention these days in Chile, which is, of all things, financial corruption, embezzlement, and tax evasion. I don't know if you know this, but besides the truth of Pinochet's legacy that Mark Ensalaco discussed, that he will always be seen as synonymous with human rights atrocities, he has actually now become the Al Capone of Chile. Al Capone, Alberto Capone, there. And U.S. documents have really made the difference here in this prosecution. The U.S. Senate uncovered bank records that showed that Pinochet had secretly stashed up to $16 million, perhaps more, in U.S. banks using false passports and false identification and hiding his name. All of this money was secretly stashed here. The origins of this money so far have not been determined, but it is clear that he could not have arrived at these sums of funds, at this wealth, without some type of illegal embezzlement or skimming activity from state coffers. And along with his legacy of being a human rights violator, he is going to go down in history with his name on a list alongside the Duvaliers and the Somosas and the Mobutus of the world, which for his key supporters is probably the worst thing of all. His key supporters in Chile were willing to overlook the disappearances, the tortures, the executions, but corruption, that was something else. The documents, I should say, also shed significant light on our own role in Chile's tragedy. Not only the role that we played in fomenting a climate in which a coup could take place between 1970 and 73, but our relationship to Augusto Pinochet, knowing full well that he was engaged in human rights atrocities. This remains, the whole controversy over this remains almost a daily one. Some of you may have read about the whole uproar at Foreign Affairs, where the reviewer there, the key analyst on Chile and Latin America, resigned because of pressure from Henry Kissinger that there not be a full airing of what the U.S. role was. And Kissinger's position has always been that the United States didn't have anything to do with the coup and wasn't involved at all. But one of the documents we've managed to get declassified is the first phone conversation that he had with Richard Nixon after the coup took place. And it's a fascinating document, actually. It's called a telcon, which is short for telephone conversation transcript. Kissinger secretly taped all of his phone calls and then had his secretary transcribe them. Of course, Nixon secretly taped all of his phone calls too. So when the two of them were speaking to each other, one was they were both taping each other without the other's knowledge. And on the Nixon side, we have the kind of audio tapes, and on the Kissinger side, we have the actual transcripts. But I just want to just share with you so you know what this document told us, recalling that Kissinger has always denied that the United States had any involvement in the coup, knowledge, whatever, played any role whatsoever, and then it was 100% Allende's culpability that he was overthrown. And you have a situation where the president says to him, they're in the middle of grumbling, complaining, both of them, about the fact that the press is not treating them as heroes because of the coup in Chile, that instead they're condemning the bloodshed and the overthrow of a democratically elected government. As Kissinger, Kissinger says, the Chilean thing is getting consolidated, referring to Pinochet's rule. And of course, the newspapers are bleeding because a pro-communist government has been overthrown. Isn't that something? Isn't that something? Nixon replies. I mean, instead of celebrating, Kissinger says, in the Eisenhower period, we would be heroes. And then Nixon says something very interesting. He wants to know, well, what was our involvement in this? And he says, well, we didn't, as you know, our hand doesn't show on this one, though, asking a question. And Kissinger says, we didn't do it. I mean, we helped them. Deleted, created conditions as great as possible. That is what he says about the U.S. role in the coup. The other issue that the documents lend important evidence to is the attitudes of our own government towards human rights violations that took place. And I thought, in part because this is a religious college, that I would bring one document, another transcript of a meeting Kissinger had at the height of Pinochet's repression, the summer of 1975, when Pinochet's foreign minister, a military official named Patricio Carvajal, came to visit Kissinger to discuss multilateral bank aid to Chile. And I'm just going to read you the opening of this meeting. The foreign minister, Patricio Carvajal, sits down. He says to Kissinger, I want to thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk to you. And this is the very first thing that the Secretary of State says to Pinochet's representative. Well, I read the briefing paper for this meeting, and it was nothing but human rights. The State Department is made up of people who have a vocation for the ministry. Because there were not enough churches for them, they went into the Department of State. These documents speak for themselves. I don't have time to elaborate on them, but they speak for themselves, and they show you dramatically, they cut through the BS, if I can say that here, of the spin that has been put on the attitudes of our government, that our government had at the time. And for that, they lend themselves to truth, and through that, to justice. I ended my book, and I'm going to end here, with a statement made by a victim of Pinochet's torture named Gabriela, and she appeared in a movie called The Pinochet Case. Has anybody seen that movie here? It's a movie I think that this program and this university would appreciate. Judge Guzman is in the opening scenes of that movie. But the movie interviews quite a few victims of atrocities. And the woman whose voice came out the most strong, as Gabriela says, is talking about the fact that it's not sure that there'll ever be a justice, there'll be a trial for the people that committed these crimes. But, she says, if in the end we are unable to take to trial those who were responsible, at least memory will provide a historical trial for them. And the wonderful news, particularly with the work of Judge Guzman, is that not only has there been tremendous advance in historical memory and the trials of history for Pinochet and his men, but there have also been courtroom trials. We have the verdict of history, and we are getting legal verdicts as well, and that is something to celebrate. Thank you.
It's also a great honor for me to be here, to be with in the presence of Judge Juan Guzman, and I thank Mark for this privilege. And I also want to thank Bert Lockwood for believing that poetry is instrumental in the understanding of human rights, and for having one of my earliest poems published at the Human Rights Quarterly almost about 20 years ago. I am a poet and a professor of literature, and my takeoff in this conversation will be quite different, as I don't have any concrete evidence and I don't have answers. I only have questions. And I think that the role of poetry and the role of the poet historically has been a role that had to do with the understanding of the human soul and the understanding of truth, from the works of Homer to the works of Pablo Neruda. Also, the instrument of poetry is the instrument of language. And truth also is very much linked to the idea of how is truth constructed, how is truth fabricated, and what are the words we use when we are trying to unveil truth. I would like to just pose a few questions for us, and maybe it will be important to discuss it during the debate. And I also think it's so remarkable, as Mark and Peter were saying, the tremendous legal victories in the field of human rights in the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, and the role that Chile has taken, as Mark says, the emblematic role of Chile. But I would also like to ask the following questions. How can a society inhabit a historical memory, not only understanding it, not only from a legalistic point of view, but in its whole complexity? How could a country, whether it be Chile, whether it would be Rwanda, whether it would be in the United States, assumes the important concept that memory has to do with the reconstruction of a collective history? How could we make the voices of the disappeared become not only an absence, but a presence? My other question is, what are the choices that the individuals and the nation have to do when you address the issue of memory? What are the responsibilities to remember? And I think that's something incredibly important, because memory, it's often ambiguous, it's often arbitrary, but also memory is also very much linked to the idea of choices. And I think that when we are trying to reconstruct a very traumatic past, as Chile's past, we have to think about what are we going to choose to remember. And the second step of what are we going to choose to remember is how are we going to engage in the activity of remembrance. I would like to say that memory is not passive, that even though memory speaks so much about the past and rethinks its place in the future, memory has to do with a present engagement, with responsibility, with commitment, and with tenacity. Without tenacity, without the pursuit of justice, without the pursuit of truth, you have no memory. I also like to just pose other questions that I do not have the answer, but I think that human rights activists, lawyers, judges, poets think about this. Does memory have a particular ethics? Does the pursuit of memory has to do with morality? Does the pursuit of memory in Chile has to do, or not only in Chile but the world, with a religious concept? Or it has to do more with a universal concept? And when I say religious, it's because one of the great debates that we are seeing in the 21st century is the idea of forgiveness. And we have to think about who forgives, who has the right to forgive. Is forgiveness, sometimes forgiveness is dangerous because it allows you to forget. Sometimes you forgive and the past is over. So I would like to pose the idea, what does it mean for a society to pursue justice, to understand truth, and to almost inhabit all these complexities, because once you have justice in place, once you have truth, what do you do with it? Basically my question is, how does one live with this truth? How does one live with justice? The work of Peter with the incredible work with the declassification of the documents, what happens with these documents? My question is, how does factual knowledge transmit into an ethical standing in one's world? I also believe that we are in this university, and I also think it's very important that the pursuit of truth be also a part of the pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of education. And I think that ultimately the incredible contributions that Judge Guzman has done to the world has to do with the ways in which the pursuit of truth educates us in our everyday life and in our everyday living. I would also like to say that that human rights, it's much more than the legalistic and the formalistic understanding of law, of order, of accountability. I like to just elevate the idea that human rights is a passion. And I think that all of us that are here have believed in this passion. But also the passion of human rights is very much linked to the passion for truth. And when you pursue truth, as Judge Guzman has said, you understand the meaning of justice. So I think that today's panel and today's event should help us ponder about the role of individual memory, historical memory, the role of nations, reinventing their future because they understood their past. And I think that's something very important that Chile has done. I'm going, because I am also very honored, and I thank Mark that a poet speaks in this panel, and I think I'm speaking for the people of my field. Poetry is a field. It's a very complex and vast field, but I also think that the role of the artist has been instrumental in the understanding of truth. And the very engaged Latin American poets have really been the ones that have actually given a name to those that disappeared, have reconstructed a literature based out of absences. And I think that we are very grateful for the idea that language can give a voice to what is unimaginable, and can even still be so daring that could create a sense of beauty with what is so unimaginable and almost unreconstructible. I'm going to end this conversation with a poem that pursues the idea of memory as a form of a question. And it's called, I'm going to only read it in English because it's too long to read it in Spanish. It's called Once Again. Once again, the women linger, talking about the disappeared. It must have been for something, isn't it true? They are no longer in vogue, the disappeared. We Chileans are all friends. Are you a Chilean? Only few died, a few thousands, no more. We Chileans are good about forgetting. Once again, the women linger, marching in their black widow dresses. They make me nervous seeing them transfigured in the secret circles of death. It wasn't my fault, they said. I hid when they came to take them away in the luxuriant summer nights. The son of my neighbor is a policeman. I am only the neighbor of that man. I knew nothing about the matter. No sé nada del asunto, I heard them say. And again, the lingering women with the red dresses of death and sparrows in their hair do not tire from dancing. They search for sanctuary in the truth and look for embraces and new children to love. We Chileans are all friends. We only kill a few. We burn some fingernails. We throw them in the river. We burn testicles and nipples, but it was a war. That is how my neighbor, the policeman, described it to me. I know nothing about the matter. No sé nada del asunto. The years pass. Words disturb nothing. Nothing has happened here. We Chileans are friends, even in the perverse secret of wicked death. And this is why the pursuit of memory is so essential, because we all know something about what happened. Thank you.
I was going to save you for last.
Yes. You were going to save me.
For last.
Well, it is my honor for being with you, loving priests and nuns, emblematic professors and artists, young women and young men that embrace the cause of human rights. Today I'll speak about just a few concepts, about the long silence that started in Chile's 9/11 in 1973 with the coup that we thought would never come to a so democratic country. That silence lasted 17 years, but in a way it continues because of what we call the dictatorship syndrome. The dictatorship syndrome is fear. Fear to be in a room with 3 people and not being able to say yet what you want to say, because the third person may be somebody from the other side, from the side of the shadows, from the side of death. Then the motto that we had during those 17 years and that we continue in a certain way having is, you cannot do that. You cannot say that. And ask that to any judge in our country, and he will say, it's absolutely true, you cannot say anything. Everything is banned still. There are agents all over the different institutions, in the Supreme Court, in the appellate courts, in the different secretaries of state, in the government. There are agents of the dictatorship that continue to maintain this syndrome alive. After entering into democracy, we realized that this syndrome had to be broken in a way, because we needed truth, because without truth we would never have had justice. But what or why does this syndrome exist? To understand it, we would have to know what we all know. What happened under the cape of silence of those 17 years? Illegal detention, torture, abduction, and assassination. How did this system work? Well, detaining people that didn't think like the rest thought, that were a danger for the country, that were a danger for the army, that were a danger for the wealthy people, and so on. Torture after the detentions. That was what we call terror of state. We needed to have these people silenced forever. The questions were, where are the weapons? Where are your comrades, your friends? Where is the money? What are your plans? Afterwards, when there was too much torture, or a person was very important for to continue life, those persons had to be killed. And the worst of all is that not only killed, but their bodies had to be hidden. And here we will speak a little later about what happens to the people that do not find the bodies of their loved ones. As you can see, there was a great conspiracy. But after some time, I have acknowledged, as many people have done so, that we have all been involved in this conspiracy. Soldiers that did the worst part of the job, perhaps. Secretaries of state that informed that there were no detentions. Judges that accepted the information and that archived the cases. Medias that collaborated and disinformed us. Common people's ignorance. Common people's acceptance, and so on. And as the dictatorship was so harsh, people did not want to see nor hear. They didn't want to speak, and they couldn't speak. One of the consequences, then, of this important silence is the impunity that comes from it. So, little by little, breaking this era of silence, we have just begun to know the truth, the legal truth. We've always known the hidden truth, but the legal truth is the one that we start to know with the evidence that we receive. Justice begins with truth, and truth can only exist when the barrier of the dictatorship syndrome is lost progressively. And that began to occur in the 90s, and due principally to the courage of the Chilean church, of the human rights lawyers and writers and journalists and historians, with the families of the victims, and with the necessity of reconciliation. You said that reconciliation is perhaps impossible. I think you're right. It is very difficult to reconciliate when there are missing people, when the families of those missing people have not begun their mourning, when they have not had their consolation. You have the Antigone drama open till eternity, till the people are no longer existing. This Antigone tragedy is the one that keeps our injuries open, and fighting and struggling as we must for consolation. I think we'll never have it totally, but we will have it in great part if we manage to continue with truth and to honor justice. Thank you very much.
I'd like to say what a privilege it is to be able to share this podium platform with this distinguished panel. Need the mic? Sorry. No problem. I would like to offer a few comments. They're sort of in different directions, but sort of reacting. We have seen just in the past few weeks here that even in this country, which clearly is a pretty stable country, just how dangerous the activity of judging can be. With the murders of the husband and mother of the federal judge in Chicago by a disgruntled someone that had whose suit had been dismissed. In Atlanta, Georgia, last week, with the killing of the local judge there by someone that was being brought before him. From my experience in Chile and sort of understanding of the situation there, the gentleman that we have with us today, we owe an enormous debt to in terms of the courage of being able to stand up in a society where often he was receiving death threats, and not just to oneself, but to one's family. I think we all would like to think that if we were in such a situation that we would be able to summon up the courage to be able to withstand those political pressures. I think, however, if we are honest, know that the reality is that it is the rare individual who has the courage to and patriotism to be able to withstand those threats. And I just wanted to pay particular debt of gratitude to the judge, who is upholding the rule of law, is the way I would characterize it. As a law professor and lawyer, it is sort of the noblest thing that we attempt to teach. But as we see the criticism in our own country of what so many lawyers do, I think that often that we fall short of that ideal. But we are particularly proud of the contributions of Judge Guzman to promoting that ideal. Lest you think that we are talking in terms of a debt to him on behalf of the Chilean people, I would just like to underscore the broader context of what he is doing. And from the bench in Chile, he probably is unable to see the broader impact. But I think we only need to look in the past few months here to see that we live in a different world, and that the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine can be translated into events in Kyrgyzstan and in Lebanon, where people become inspired by the democratic forces that are displayed in distant countries. And I would submit to you that in this area of how do we deal, we call it transitional justice, and there probably is, from my editing with the Human Rights Quarterly and my Pennsylvania book series, I would suggest to you that it's probably the hottest topic in scholarship, dealing with the question of how does a society which has gone through a human rights nightmare get back to some sense of normalcy. And this is a field where we don't know a lot. I mean, we are learning, if you will, of what is the role of truth, what is the role of reconciliation, these kinds of commissions, what is the effect upon individuals who come before a court and testify. A lot of it is guesses, and I would suggest that we're in the process of learning, and it is clear that courts are not the perfect solution by any means because of the limited nature of rules of evidence and what is pertinent, and that the experience can often not be particularly personal or sensitive to the agony that an individual is undergoing by reliving the memories. So we are in a period where I think our knowledge is developing here, and that it's clear that one size doesn't fit all, that what might be appropriate for Chile wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for South Africa. But it is a very interesting and exciting period in terms of the scholarship from different disciplines that are attempting to lend insight into what is the situation. Eric Stover, for instance, at the University of Berkeley's Human Rights Center has just done a book for my manuscript where he has interviewed all of the witnesses who came before the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal up until about 6 months ago about their personal experiences. And it's not as we would have necessarily suspected. I think their experiences were less than satisfactory in terms of their own reactions to the experience. So I guess I would suggest that we clearly have a lot to learn, but I'm going to end my remarks now, and I would mention that I think today it was reconfirmed for you what I understood 20 years ago when I published Marjorie Agosin in the Human Rights Quarterly, that the power of poetry in terms of giving us a sense of insight into the pain and agony of human rights is often much more powerful than the lawyer's brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Bert. Thank you, University of Dayton. I must say that I'm delighted to be here for a number of reasons, but I do have one regret. That is that my students are not sitting amongst you. I teach human rights courses, and very often I'm exposed to undergraduates who bring to the human rights message, the study of human rights, this ingrained cynicism, nothing can be done. We are against this massive power. I certainly believe that when Peter presents evidence that's been blocked out by the CIA, it confirms that cynicism. We as citizens of the United States have much to be concerned when our government responds in certain ways. But I also try to deliver to my students a message of hope. And if they were sitting here today, I would tell them there is hope. I often refer to heroes of human rights. Some of you may know from your own studies of Raphael Lemkin, who came from Poland, a lawyer escaping the Holocaust, who almost single-handedly, without an NGO, without money, brought about the Genocide Convention, invented the word, wrote a book, and convinced the UN that we needed to make genocide a crime. I think of heroes like Simon Wiesenthal, who for years, sitting in his small offices, collected data and information about war criminals when no one else cared. When they said, these are old men, these are old women you're looking for. These are the heroes of human rights. These are the people who we can look to and say, we can make a difference. To be honored here to sit on a panel with Judge Guzman is further evidence, this time in person, of a hero of human rights, someone who almost, I wouldn't say single-handedly, because we know, I've spoken to him last night, he has colleagues who's supportive and the like, but based on his personal courage, has made a difference. Some of you may know from my previous visits to Dayton that while Mark deals with Chile, I deal with Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. And there the key word is lustration. Some of you may not know what that word means. This is from a recent announcement that the Moldovan parliament rejects a law on lustration. The bill was introduced. Members of the communist faction argued in opposition to the law that there may arise, an atmosphere of dissent and hatred in society. Hence, in Moldova, the former part of the Soviet Union, near Romania, near Ukraine, they've made a recent decision, bury the past. Lustration, for those of you who don't have a dictionary at hand, comes from the Latin lustrum, a religious act related to a freeing from sin, guilt, or defilement, a cleansing. It's a very important concept in Eastern Europe. In the year 1999, I visited the refugee camps of Albania where the victims of Serbian atrocities gave me testimony that was to be sent to The Hague, those very courts that are now holding Milosevic in the dock and looking at his part in that act. The very taking of that testimony, as a lawyer, taking that testimony in those camps where people worried about their husbands, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters, who were missing while they were sitting in a tent in Albania, safe from atrocity, from the horrific experiences that they have done. The very fact that they could tell me and that I was going to deliver that testimony to The Hague made a difference in their lives. The tears were there, they cried, it was cathartic, but they knew that someone cared, and they knew that someone would take this testimony and it would be used in a court of law. As Bert has said, this is not just a Chilean problem. This is a universal problem. Lustration is important not only for the needs, the personal needs that we have, but as Jose Zalakut said in the Hastings Law Journal in 1992, the ghost of the past, if not exercised to the fullest extent possible, will continue to haunt the nation tomorrow. If we don't seek truth and then proceed to seek justice, then the future is not as bright. It is more difficult to obtain. I've worked in Romania. The call for airing out the past amongst the victims of Ceausescu is very real. Bulgaria, Albania, every place that I have worked, there has been a call, please bring these people to justice. Judge Guzman gives us an example, as did Simon Wiesenthal, as did the others who came before him, and I hope will come after him, that we must bring to justice the wrongdoers. This is not a new concept. We heard a poem that's very touching, and literature gives us answers that often law does not. Those of you who studied your Greek classics, you all know Sophocles and you all know Oedipus. And you all know that the beginning of the story of Oedipus is when he's walking around the land. There is drought, there is locust, there is famine, there is death. And he goes to the priest. And the priest says, you must help us. You must cleanse our society, because if we are going to rid ourselves of this vile situation, if we're going to see the light, if there's going to be a rainbow, if we are going to have the crops, we need to deal with the past so we can move on to the future. I was very touched when Peter noted what's in the CIA, the truth shall set you free. I think it's whoever, the architect who did that should be given the Nobel Peace Prize. And perhaps the hypocrite prize of the world will go to someone else. But for the moment, we could certainly say, I'm happy that my tax dollars put that on it. But I'm also reminded that before our national archives, there's a quote from Shakespeare. And it's one that I take to heart. I believe, if my memory serves me right, it comes from The Tempest. What's past is prologue. Few words. What's past is prologue. What came before is only the beginning of tomorrow. It sits before the building that houses the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the other fine documents that we cherish. We owe a debt of gratitude to Judge Guzman, because it is a lesson not just for us, but for the Albanians. I will be in Albania this summer. I'll bring that lesson to them. I work with Moldovans. I work with others. To know that there are courageous judges, and I think Bert is quite correct, saying that the rule of law shall guide us and that judges must implement that rule of law, well, that's the answer to the problem. And so we owe a debt of gratitude to Judge Guzman, and I thank the panelists for this opportunity to express my few remarks. Thank you very much.
Tiene corazón de tierra y alas de palomino.